Days before our dream cruise, my stepson sent a cruel text, demanding only his real mother come and called me a poor woman, while my husband simply nodded and walked away with him anyway. My phone buzzed at 5:58 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I'd set an alarm for 6, and the buzz beat it by 2 minutes. Kellen's name lit up the screen. Change of plans. Only my real mother comes on this cruise, not you. Poor women don't belong on trips like this. I read it twice, lying flat in the dark, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't rearrange. They just sat there, glowing, cruel, and grammatically correct. My suitcase was already by the door, packed the night before, tagged with a little brass luggage tag shaped like a starfish, paid for, every stitch of it on my card. I got up and walked into the bathroom. Weston was leaning over the sink, brushing his teeth, still in the gray undershirt he'd slept in. I held the phone up without a word and let him read it over the sound of running water. He rinsed his mouth, spit, set the toothbrush down in the cup we'd bought at a Bed Bath & Beyond that didn't exist anymore. Then his eyes drifted past me, toward the hallway, toward my suitcase sitting there with its starfish tag. He nodded, small, almost nothing. The kind of nod you give a weather report that says it might rain later. Inconvenient, not worth arguing with. He's stressed about graduation, Weston said, picking his toothbrush back up like the conversation was already closing. I'll talk to him on the ship. Smooth it over. Smooth it over, I repeated. He didn't hear the edge in my voice. Or he heard it and decided, the way he always decided, that hearing it and responding to it were two different jobs, and only one of them was his that morning. 20 minutes later, a horn honked out front. 2 short taps, familiar, impatient. I looked through the curtain and saw Kellen already sitting in the driver's seat of the Honda Civic I had been quietly making payments on for 2 years, sunglasses on, radio loud enough that I could feel the bass through the window glass. Weston grabbed his duffel bag off the bed. He kissed my cheek the way you'd kiss a stranger who was holding up a boarding line, fast and impersonal, already turning away before his lips left my skin. We'll talk when I'm back, he said. I stood in the doorway in my robe and watched the car back down the driveway, watched it swing out onto Vesper Lane, watched it shrink into nothing at the end of the block. Neither of them turned around. Not once. Not even the fast, guilty glance you'd give a house you were leaving behind for a week. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that because I've told this story enough times now to know people expect the crying part. It didn't come. What came instead was a strange, cold clarity, the kind you get right before you do something you can't undo. I sat down at the kitchen table, still in my robe, and opened my banking app, not to feel sorry for myself. I promised myself that, sitting there with the coffee maker gurgling behind me and the house gone quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in 8 years, I opened it to finally look, really look, for the first time without flinching away, at what my money had actually been doing in this family, and what it had been buying everyone except me. I am 39 years old. I run a small bookkeeping firm out of a converted sunroom 2 blocks from downtown Millhaven, Ohio, a business I built from nothing starting the year I turned 28, back when I was doing tax returns for restaurant owners at their kitchen tables in exchange for whatever cash they had in the register that week. Cross-ledger bookkeeping now has 11 regular clients, a part-time assistant named Raina, and a waiting list that embarrasses me a little when I think about how small the operation still is compared to what people assume when they hear I own a business. I bought the house on Vesper Lane when I was 26, a modest 3-bedroom with a leaky gutter and a kitchen that hadn't been touched since 1988, priced at $189,000 because the previous owner needed to move fast for a job in Cincinnati. I put down everything I had, financed the rest over 15 years, and lived there alone for 4 years, eating a lot of rice and beans and refusing every invitation that cost more than $12. When I was 30, my mother died of pancreatic cancer, fast, the way it sometimes goes, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral home. She left me $60,000 in life insurance, money she'd been quietly building for 2 decades working as a school secretary in Delphos, Ohio, money she never spent on herself because she was always saving it for someone. I used almost all of it to pay off the remaining balance on the house. I remember standing in the loan office on a Tuesday afternoon, signing the paperwork, and feeling like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath for 4 years. I met Weston Hale a year later, at a Millhaven Chamber of Commerce mixer I only attended because Raina made me go. He was 42 then, recently divorced, still carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent 2 years fighting over custody schedules and car payments with a woman who no longer wanted him but also didn't want to let him go easily. He had a 14-year-old son named Kellen. He talked about that boy the entire night, over cheap wine and a cheese plate, in a way that struck me as devoted rather than desperate. I liked that about him. I still think, honestly, that it was real. We dated for 2 years before we married. I met Kellen properly about 4 months in, a stiff, watchful boy who called me by my first name and nothing else, who studied me across the dinner table the way you'd study a substitute teacher you weren't sure you had to respect. I told myself that was normal. Kids don't warm up to their parents' new partner overnight, especially not a kid who'd watched his parents' marriage come apart in real time. Weston's divorce had left him in rough financial shape. Denise, his ex-wife, had run up almost $18,000 in credit card debt during their last 2 years together, debt that got split in the settlement, and Weston's credit score was still recovering when we got married. That's the reason, or at least the reason he gave me, for why we never refinanced the Vesper Lane house to put his name on the deed. Let's wait until my credit's cleaner, he said, the year we got married, standing in that same kitchen with the 1988 cabinets I'd since replaced. No sense doing it twice. I agreed. It made sense at the time. We simply moved him and Kellen into my paid-off house instead of buying something new. And for 8 years, let's wait quietly became we never did. Our wedding was small, 40 guests, held on a Saturday in October at a church on Delphos Avenue that smelled faintly of lilies and old carpet. Kellen was 14 and wore a suit that didn't quite fit him yet, sleeves an inch too short, and stood beside his father looking like a boy who'd been told to be somewhere, rather than a boy who wanted to be there. I remember catching his eye during the reception, trying to smile at him the way you'd smile at a nervous kid, and he looked away first, toward the dessert table, and I told myself that was fine, that trust takes time, that 14-year-olds are allowed to be guarded. The first year of the marriage was, if anything, gentle. We settled into a rhythm. I drove Kellen to soccer practice twice a week because Weston's schedule at Ferncrest ran late on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I learned which cereal he'd actually eat, and which he'd let go stale in the pantry. I sat through 2 parent-teacher conferences where his 8th grade English teacher kept calling me Mom before Weston gently corrected her each time. I didn't mind the correction. I minded a little that Kellen never once corrected it himself, never once said, "She's not my mom, but she's here," which would have cost him nothing and would have meant everything. I want to tell you about the Jeep because if I'm honest with myself, that was the first crack. The first moment I should have understood exactly what kind of family I'd married into. Kellen turned 16 the November after our wedding. He wanted a car. Weston didn't have $9,000 sitting around. Child support and the divorce debt had seen to that. So I did, tucked away in a savings account I'd built slowly, dollar by dollar, in the years before I met either of them. I found a used Jeep Wrangler at a dealership in Marion, dark green, 91,000 miles, $9,200 out the door. I paid for it in full. On the morning we surprised Kellen with it in the driveway, keys tied with a ribbon. Weston stood next to him with his arms slung over his shoulders and said, "Your dad worked a lot of overtime for this one, bud." I was standing 4 feet away. I remember the exact distance because I remember doing the math on it later. 4 feet, close enough to touch. Close enough that there was no possible way Weston hadn't seen me standing there when he said it. Kellen turned and hugged him. Just him. He never looked my direction at all. Not even to say a perfunctory thank you. And Weston never corrected the record. Not that day and not in the 8 years since. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things were nothing for a very long time, and I want to walk you through exactly how that happened because I think it's the part of this story that matters most. Not the ending, but the long, quiet middle where a reasonable woman convinces herself that erasure is just a personality quirk in the man she loves. 2 years ago, Kellen's Honda Civic, the car he'd had since starting Ohio State, bought used with a small loan co-signed by Weston, needed a new transmission after the old one finally gave out on I-71 outside Columbus. Before that, though, there was the matter of the monthly note itself. $300 a month, and Kellen was chronically short. Weston came to me quietly one evening in the garage, the two of us alone, while he pretended to organize a toolbox that didn't need organizing. "Can you just cover his car payment for a while?" he asked. Quietly, though, so he doesn't feel like he owes you. "Let me tell him it's coming from the family account." There was no family account. There was my account, and there was Weston's, and mine had considerably more in it. A fact we both understood without ever saying out loud. I agreed anyway. $300 a month, straight out of my checking, timed to hit 2 days before the due date so it would never bounce. 6 months into that arrangement, we were at a Memorial Day cookout at Weston's cousin Portia's house, paper plates and a card table sagging under potato salad, when I heard Kellen telling a group of his friends near the cooler, "My dad's been covering my car note this whole time, man. Never lets me down." I was standing 8 feet away, holding a plate of deviled eggs I'd made from my own mother's recipe. He never once looked my direction. Portia, overhearing, turned to me and said, "Your husband's a good man, taking care of that boy like that." And I said, "He really is," because what else was there to say at a cookout with a paper plate in my hand? I told myself it was nothing. The transmission died the following spring. $3,000, a number the mechanic gave Weston over the phone while I sat in the next room doing invoices for a client. Weston came and found me, phone still in his hand, and said, "I don't have it right now, not until payday. Can you wire it tonight? I'll make sure Kellen knows it came from both of us." I wired $3,000 at 11:40 that night, sitting at my kitchen table in the dark, the blue light of my laptop the only thing on in the house. Weston never told him it came from both of us. I heard it secondhand 3 weeks later, from Raina of all people, who'd run into Kellen at a gas station. He said his dad pulled $3,000 out of nowhere for him, said it like it was nothing. I told Raina that was generous of Weston. I meant it in a way. I just left myself out of the sentence the way I'd been trained to. I told myself it was nothing. Junior year, Kellen hit a snag with his financial aid, a verification hold on his FAFSA that dragged into October and left a $6,800 gap between what the university expected and what had actually cleared. Weston called me from his office, voice tight in a way I recognized as panic dressed up as calm. "If this doesn't get paid by Friday, they'll drop him from his classes. Can you cover it? I'll pay you back." He never paid me back, and I never asked him to, because by then some part of me understood that asking would only make things worse, that the money flowing quietly and invisibly was the entire point of the arrangement, not an oversight in it. I moved $6,800 from my my business's rainy day fund into Kellen's tuition portal myself, using the login information Weston had given me, just for emergencies. When it was done, Weston said, "Let's not tell Denise. She'll feel like she failed him if she finds out we had to step in like this." I remember thinking, distantly, that my name hadn't even come up as a possibility for hurt feelings, only hers. I told myself, one more time, that it was nothing. The cruise was supposed to be different. A gift, freely given, not a quiet bailout dressed up as generosity. Kellen was graduating from Ohio State in May with a degree in sports management, and Weston floated the idea back in February, sitting across from me at this same kitchen table with his laptop open to a cruise line's website. "Meridian Dawn does a 7-night out of Port Canaveral," he said. "Bahamas, private island stop, the whole thing. I want to do this for him. For us, really. A real family trip before he moves into his own life." I liked the idea more than I want to admit now. I pictured us on a balcony somewhere, the three of us finally feeling like something, instead of two of them and me hovering at the edges holding a checkbook nobody acknowledged. I found the booking myself 2 nights later. Balcony suite, upgraded dining package, excursion bundle for the private island stop. $11,400. Charged in 2 installments to my card because Weston's was still recovering. Always still recovering. 8 years into recovering. I set the whole thing up under my Meridian Dawn Rewards account because I was the one doing the actual work of booking it. The transfers, the dining reservations, the excursion slots that filled up fast and needed to be grabbed the morning they opened. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was the family's de facto travel agent, the same way I was its de facto accountant, its de facto emergency fund, its de facto everything that required follow-through instead of applause. 2 weeks before we were supposed to leave, Weston took a work trip to Cleveland with 3 of his colleagues from Ferncrest Supply, the hardware distribution company where he manages regional accounts. I drove up on the second night to have dinner with the group, something I rarely did, mostly because Raina insisted I needed to get out of the office more. Somewhere between the appetizers and the entrees, one of Weston's co-workers, a cheerful man named Dale who I'd met maybe twice, leaned across the table and said, "Weston tells us you're taking your boy on some big graduation cruise. That's great, man. Good on you." Weston smiled and said, "Yeah, figured he earned it. Kid worked hard." I sat there with a fork halfway to my mouth. I had booked the trip. I had paid for the trip. I had spent 3 consecutive Saturday mornings on hold with the cruise line's customer service line, trying to get our dining times to align. And in that entire sentence, taking your boy on some big graduation cruise, there had been no room made for me at all. Not even a passing "we." I smiled at Dale and said something about how excited I was too. And Weston didn't correct anything. Didn't say our card. Didn't say she booked it. Didn't say anything that would have cost him 30 seconds and given me back an ounce of the credit that was mine. A month before that, actually, there'd been Kellen's 22nd birthday, the last one before graduation, and I want to include it here because it fits the pattern too neatly to leave out. Weston planned a dinner at a steakhouse in Dublin, the good one with the white tablecloths, and asked me a week ahead of time if I'd cover it since his card was maxed from a work conference he'd expensed wrong and was still waiting on reimbursement for. I paid for the dinner, $310 including tip, on my card, at the table, in front of Kellen, Bryn, Denise, and Rick. When the check came, Weston reached for it with a practiced motion, said, "I've got this, everybody," and I quietly slid my card across before the waiter could take his, the way I'd done a dozen times before without anyone at the table registering it as strange. Denise thanked Weston for dinner on her way out. Kellen hugged his father goodbye and said, "Thanks for tonight, Dad. This was great." Nobody thanked me. I told myself, again, that it was nothing, that gratitude wasn't the point of generosity, even as some smaller, more honest part of me understood that I was simply tired of being the answer to a question nobody thought to ask. I brought it up to him that night, in the hotel room, quietly, the way I'd learned to bring things up so they wouldn't turn into a fight I'd lose anyway. "Dale made it sound like this whole trip was your idea, and your money," I said. Weston sighed, the particular sigh he used when he thought I was being difficult about something small. "It's not a big deal, Viv. I don't correct every little thing people assume. Does it really matter who said what to Dale? It matters to me," I said. "I hear you," he said, which is a phrase I've come to understand means the exact opposite of what it claims to mean. "I'll be better about it." He was not better about it. Nothing changed, because nothing about the underlying arrangement had ever actually been named out loud between us as a problem. I had raised concerns before, quietly, reasonably, the way you're supposed to when you love someone and want to believe the best about them. Each time, Weston had some version of the same answer. "It's not a big deal." He's stressed. "I'll fix it later. Let me have this." And each time, I absorbed the answer and filed it away and told myself that a marriage was made of 1,000 small concessions, that this was simply mine to make. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. 10 days before we were supposed to fly to Florida, I noticed the tone in the house shifting in a way I couldn't name yet. Kellen had been distant with me for weeks already, but this was different, a coldness with an edge to it, like something was being decided just out of earshot. I found out what, more or less, 4 days before departure. I was in the kitchen finishing a client's quarterly filing when I overheard Weston on the back porch, phone to his ear, voice low but not low enough. "I know, Denise. I hear you. It's a family trip, and I want it to feel like that." I didn't hear her side of the call. I didn't need to. Weston came back inside a few few minutes later, wouldn't quite meet my eyes, and said, Denise mentioned maybe doing something separate with Kellen before the wedding. I mean, before the cruise. Some kind of mother-son thing. I told her we'd figure it out. Figure out what exactly? I asked. Nothing's decided, he said, which is also a phrase I've learned to translate. It means something has already been decided, just not by anyone willing to tell you to your face. That same night, Kellen came home from Bryn's apartment, his girlfriend of a year and a half, a sweet, quiet nursing student who I liked a great deal more than her boyfriend at that point, and walked past me in the hallway without a word, phone lit up in his hand, thumbs moving fast. I remember the particular quality of that silence. Heavy, deliberate, the silence of someone rehearsing something. I want to tell you about a habit I'd developed over the years, almost without noticing I was doing it, because I managed most of the family's logistics. Permission slips back when Kellen was younger, insurance paperwork, appointment reminders, and later cruise confirmations and excursion bookings. Weston and I had a shared email address years earlier, hail.family. Logistics, set up back when Kellen was in middle school, so both households, ours and Denise's, could stay coordinated on schedules without endless separate texts. I was the one who mostly checked it. Weston mostly forgot it existed. Denise still used it occasionally, out of habit, for anything involving Kellen's schooling or health. Over the years, it had filled up with hundreds of unread threads, old permission slips, insurance renewals, appointment confirmations, the kind of digital junk drawer nobody clears out because clearing it out never feels urgent. I didn't think about that inbox at all that week. I had no reason to. It would matter later, more than I could have imagined standing in that hallway watching my stepson's thumbs move across his phone screen, but that night I only felt a low, humming unease I couldn't yet put a name to, and I went to bed early, and I told myself one final time that it was probably nothing. The text came 4 days later at 5:58 in the morning, and by now you already know what it said, and you already know what Weston did with it, which was nothing at all except nod and finish brushing his teeth and drive away in a car I was still paying off. So let me take you back to that kitchen table, coffee going cold in front of me, banking app open on my phone, because that's where the real story actually starts. I didn't cry, but I also didn't move for a long time. I sat there and watched the numbers on the screen the way you'd watch a slow-motion replay of a car crash you already knew the ending to. 2 years of transactions. I started scrolling back through them methodically, the way I scroll through a client's books when something isn't reconciling, when I know in my gut a number is wrong before I've found the line that proves it. $300, recurring, the second of every month, memo line reading Civic, K, 24 consecutive months. $7,200, one transfer, 11:40 at night, $3,000 even, memo line reading transmission, one transfer to Ohio State's student accounts portal, $6,800, made under Weston's login but from my account, because his didn't have it and mine did, and that was simply how things worked in our house. 2 charges to Meridian Dawn Cruise Line, $4,000 and then $7,400, $11,400 total. My card, my rewards number, my 3 Saturday mornings on hold. I sat with a pen and an actual piece of paper, because some part of me needed to see it written by hand to believe it, and I added the numbers the way my mother taught me to add numbers, right to left, carrying the tens. $28,400 in 2 years. Quietly funneled through my accounts and, as far as I could tell from every conversation I'd overheard, credited publicly to a man who, 4 hours earlier, had watched his son call me a poor woman and responded by nodding and brushing his teeth. I sat with that number for a long time, long enough for the coffee to go from hot to lukewarm to genuinely cold. And then, almost without deciding to, I opened my laptop and pulled up hail.family. Logistics, the shared inbox I hadn't really looked through in years, because I wanted to see the cruise confirmation email one more time, wanted to see my own name on the booking, proof that at least in one corner of the internet, the truth of who had paid for what still existed in writing. I found the cruise confirmation easily enough, but while I was in there, scrolling past old dentist reminders and a decade-old permission slip for a 6th grade field trip to Kosi, I saw a thread from 3 years earlier that I had never opened. The subject line was blank, just re, the kind of thread that had clearly started somewhere else and gotten looped in almost by accident. It was between Weston and Denise. I was C'd, apparently, though I'd never noticed, buried the way a single email gets buried among 400 others in an account nobody actually reads. I opened it. Denise had written to Weston about splitting some cost for Kellen's junior prom, a tuxedo rental, a corsage, a limo split with 3 other families, small money, a few $100s, nothing close to what would come later. Weston's reply, 3 lines long, was the one that stopped my breath in my chest. Don't worry about it. I've got it covered. Vivian doesn't need credit for this stuff. It's easier if Kellen just sees me as the one who provides for him. Keeps things simple. I read it 4 times. Each time I hoped it would say something different. It never did. It wasn't carelessness. That was the thing I had to sit with, right there at that kitchen table, with the light coming up gray and then gold through the window over the sink. I had spent 2 years, maybe longer, telling myself that Weston's silence about my money was thoughtlessness, a flaw of a man too tired and too used to old habits to think about how it landed on me. But this email, dated 3 years back, written in his own hand to his own ex-wife, proved it was a strategy, a deliberate, considered choice made and remade every single time an opportunity came up to say my name out loud in connection with the money that kept this family running. Vivian doesn't need credit for this stuff. He had decided that on my behalf, apparently, Genuinely, without ever once asking me if that was true. It wasn't. I had never once needed credit. I would have been satisfied, genuinely, entirely satisfied, with the truth simply existing somewhere Kellen could stumble across it eventually, on his own timeline, in his own way. What I had needed, what I had never once gotten, was to not be actively, deliberately erased from my own generosity so that a 22-year-old boy could grow up believing his father single-handedly provided for him, while calling the actual provider a poor woman who didn't belong on the trip she'd paid $11,400 for. I kept scrolling after that, almost against my own will, the way you keep pressing on a bruise once you found it. Further down the same thread, buried in a reply from over a year later, I found a shorter exchange, just 4 lines, from the week of Kellen's college move-in. Denise had written asking whether Weston needed help covering the dorm deposit, and Weston had replied, "We're fine. Vivian's got the account handled, don't worry about it." I sat with that one too. It wasn't cruel in the same obvious way the prom email was. There was no line about credit, no explicit strategy spelled out, but it confirmed something I'd started to suspect the moment I found the first email. This wasn't an isolated lapse in judgment made under pressure. It was a pattern stretching back years, a habit so worn into the shape of our marriage that Weston didn't even seem to notice himself doing it anymore. My name appeared in that inbox exactly twice in 3 years, both times as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be acknowledged. Vivian's got the account handled. Not Vivian's paying for this, not we should thank her. Just the quiet, procedural mention of an account. The same language you'd use for a checking balance or a line of credit. I closed the laptop. I sat very still for a moment, the way you do right before a decision settles into your bones instead of just your mind. And then I picked up my phone and called Bianca Ruiz, a friend I'd known since our 20s, back when we were both doing books for the same string of Millhaven restaurants, back before she left bookkeeping to run Ruiz Capital Holdings, a company that did fast cash closings on residential properties, the kind of company that could turn a house into a wire transfer in under a week if the seller was motivated and the paperwork was clean. "Is your company still buying on Vesper Lane?" I asked her, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Always," she said. "That street turns over fast." "What's going on, Viv?" "I need to sell my house," I said. "This week, if it's possible. Cash, as is." There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a friend deciding whether to ask questions or just help. Bianca chose help. "I can be at your place within the hour," she said. She was there in 55 minutes, a folder under her arm, a calculator app already open on her phone. We sat at the kitchen table where 4 days later Weston would sit and eat cereal without looking at me before his flight, and she walked me through the numbers. The house free and clear, no liens, no mortgage, appraised the previous year at $268,000 for insurance purposes. Ruiz Capital could offer $241,000 cash, close within 72 hours, no inspection contingencies, no repairs required. "Once we start this," Bianca said, watching my face the way you watch someone standing near a ledge, "I'm not slowing down for second thoughts. If you want time to think, take it now. I've never been more sure of anything," I told her, and I meant it in a way that surprised me, a calm certainty I hadn't felt about a single decision in years. I signed the preliminary paperwork that afternoon. Then I opened the loan servicing app for Kellen's Civic and canceled the automatic payment I'd set up 2 years earlier. 24 months of silent support ended with 8 words on a screen. "No further payments will be processed on this account." I spent the rest of that day and most of the next packing only what was truly mine. My mother's jewelry box, the one with the loose hinge I'd never gotten around to fixing. Her hand-stitched quilt, faded blue and white, made the winter before she got sick. My grandmother's Bible, water-stained on the back cover from a flood in a basement in 1974. I left the mug Kellen had given me 2 Christmases ago, white ceramic, black lettering that read "World's Okayest Stepmom," a joke gift he'd bought at a drugstore checkout line and handed me without wrapping paper. I left it sitting exactly where it sat on the counter, handle facing out the way I always kept it. One box I packed slower than the others. Our wedding album, dark green leather, 8 years of anniversaries I had dusted every single week without ever once missing a Sunday. I sat with it open on my lap for almost 20 minutes before I finally closed it and set it in the box. 3 days after the text, I sat in a quiet office above a title company on Bexley Avenue, sunlight coming through Venetian blinds, a notary sliding pages across a table toward me one at a time. No music, no drama, just the particular hush of a room where large permanent things happen in complete silence. "Congratulations," the notary said, stamping the final page. "The sale is final." By that evening, I was already renting a truck. By the following morning, I was 2 states away, unpacking boxes onto bare floors in a small apartment that still smelled like fresh paint, in a building on the edge of Fort Wayne, Indiana, a city I'd chosen almost at random from a map, mostly because it was close enough to drive to and far enough that I wouldn't run into anyone from my old life at a grocery store. The ship, Meridian Dawn, 7 nights, Bahamas, and a private island stop, was due back into Port Canaveral on a Saturday. I knew that. I'd booked the whole trip myself, after all, memorized every departure and arrival time the way I memorized client deadlines. I pictured them driving the 4.5 hours back to Millhaven from Orlando, tan and relaxed, talking about excursions and buffet lines, with no idea at all what was waiting, or rather, what wasn't. The call came at 4:12 that Saturday afternoon. I was standing in my new kitchen, unpacking a box of mismatched dishware, there when my phone lit up with Weston's name. I let it ring twice before I answered, not for drama, but because I genuinely needed those 2 rings to decide whether I was ready. Vivian. His voice was already cracking before he'd said more than my name. Vivian, what did you do? We're standing in the driveway. There's a moving truck here. There's furniture on the lawn that isn't ours. The locks don't work. What is going on? I sold the house, I said. My voice came out flatter than I expected, almost gentle, the way you might explain something obvious to a person who was, for the first time, genuinely listening. You sold Vivian. That's our house. That's Kellen's home. You can't just... It was my house, I said. It's been my house since I was 26 years old. Your name was never on that deed, Weston, because you never asked to see it, and I never offered. And somewhere in 8 years, neither of us ever fixed that. I found the email you sent Denise 3 years ago about the prom, about how I don't need credit for things, about keeping it simple. The line went quiet for a moment. In the background, I could hear Kellen's voice, sharp and rising, and then another voice I recognized even through the phone speaker. Denise, apparently there too, either to pick Kellen up or drop something off. I never fully understood which, and it stopped mattering the moment I heard her say, clearly enough to carry, Weston, what is she talking about? What email? Nothing, Weston said. And even now, even in the middle of the collapse of everything, his first instinct was still to smooth it over, to manage the room, to keep the truth contained to whoever already knew it. It's not nothing, I said, loud enough that I knew it would carry through the phone to whoever was standing near him. For 2 years, I paid Kellen's car note, $7,200. I covered his transmission, $3,000, wired at midnight because you asked me to and told me you'd tell him it came from both of us. You didn't. I covered a $6,800 gap in his tuition so he wouldn't get dropped from his classes, and you asked me not to tell his mother because you didn't want her to feel like she'd failed him. And 4 days ago, days before a cruise I paid $11,400 for, your son told me poor women don't belong on trips like this. And you nodded. You nodded, Weston, and then you finished brushing your teeth. I heard Denise's voice again, quieter this time, edged with something that sounded like genuine shock. Weston, is that true? I can explain all of it, he said, though he offered no explanation, just the promise of one, the way he always had. I'm sure you can, I said. I'm not a poor woman, Weston. I'm the woman who paid for absolutely everything in this family and asked for nothing except to be told the truth about it. You had 8 years to say my name out loud in front of your son. You chose not to, every single time. I'm done funding a life that keeps making it painfully clear I don't belong in it. I heard Kellen's voice cut in, tight and furious. This is insane. You're punishing us for a text? You're seriously homeless shaming us over a text? I'm not punishing anyone, I said, and I felt for the first time in years entirely calm saying it. I'm simply no longer available to be your family's invisible bank account. That's not punishment, Kellen. That's a boundary. You should look up the difference sometime. I hung up. My hands weren't even shaking, which surprised me more than anything else that day. What I learned later, mostly from Paula, Weston's older sister, came in pieces over the following weeks, the way news does when it's traveling through a family that's suddenly split down the middle and figuring out which half it belongs to. Denise had not, in fact, come to pick Kellen up out of some warm maternal instinct. She'd come because Weston had asked her to swing by with a spare phone charger Kellen had left at her place before the cruise, a small, ordinary errand that put her directly in the driveway at the exact moment the entire architecture of the marriage came down in front of her. Paula told me Denise stood on that lawn for a long time after I hung up, arms crossed, saying almost nothing, while Weston paced in circles trying to call me back 4 separate times. I didn't answer. I turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter of my new apartment and finished unpacking the mismatched dishware, one plate at a time, and let it wring itself out. Weston and Kellen spent that first night in an extended stay America off Route 23, the kind of place with a mini fridge and a coffee maker that never quite gets hot enough. Denise, according to Paula, offered them her guest room for a few nights out of what I can only assume was some tangled mix of guilt and habit, but made it clear from the start that it wasn't a long-term arrangement. Her husband Rick, apparently, was not thrilled about hosting his wife's ex-husband and stepson in all but name, and who could blame him? The car came apart next. Kellen's lender sent a missed payment notice 5 days after I canceled the automatic transfer, and by the second missed payment, a repossession warning followed, the kind with a deadline printed in bold at the bottom of the letter. Weston, for what I understand, may have been the first time in 2 years, actually paid it himself, the full balance, out of his own account, no quiet request routed through me, because there was no me left to route it through. Paula told me it took him 3 separate calls to the lender and a payment plan just to keep the Civic from getting towed off Denise's street. I felt something when I heard that, and it wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was closer to a strange, aching relief, the specific relief of watching someone finally do under pressure, the thing you'd spend 8 years quietly hoping they'd do on their own. Denise, of all people, reached out to me directly about 3 weeks after that afternoon in the driveway. I almost didn't answer the call, half expecting a defense of Weston or an accusation dressed up as concern, but her voice, when I picked up, was quieter than I expected, almost careful. I owe you an apology I don't think I can fully make, she said. I didn't know the extent of it. I knew he leaned on you for money sometimes, I'll admit that much, but I always assumed you two had agreed on it together, as a couple. I didn't know he was writing emails like that behind your back. I want you to know I never asked him to keep you out of it. That was never something I wanted. I believed her, mostly, though I noticed she never quite apologized for her own contribution to 8 years of family-only language that had always, conveniently, excluded me first. Still, it was more honesty than I'd gotten from Weston in months, and I told her so, and we left it there. Two women who would probably never be close, but no longer had any reason to be enemies either. Bryn texted me separately, a few days after that, a long message I read twice before responding. She told me she'd overheard enough in the driveway that day to understand, finally, why Kellen sometimes talked about money the way he did, casually, entitled, as if it simply appeared when needed. No history attached to it, no person behind it. I'm sorry for how he's treated you, she wrote. I've tried talking to him about it since everything happened, and he mostly just gets defensive. I don't know if that'll change. I appreciated her honesty more than I let on in my reply. I told her I hoped it would change too, for both their sakes, and that she deserved a partner who understood the difference between being provided for and being handed things without ever learning where they came from. Kellen's friends found out too eventually, the way these things always travel through a small enough circle. Dale, the coworker from Cleveland, apparently mentioned the cruise offhand to someone at Ferncrest, who happened to know one of Kellen's college roommates, and from there the actual numbers made their way back to campus in the particular distorted, half-accurate way gossip always does. Paula told me Kellen complained to her once on the phone that people kept asking him whether it was true his stepmom paid for basically everything, and he'd just never told anyone. I don't know what he said back to them. I don't know if it embarrassed him, or if he simply shrugged it off the way he seemed to shrug off most things that required him to sit with an uncomfortable truth for longer than a few seconds. Paula didn't know either. She said he changed the subject fast, the way people do when a question lands somewhere they'd rather not look. The family split cleanly enough that I could have drawn the line with a ruler. Portia, the cousin who'd once told me, over deviled eggs, what a good man Weston was, texted me 3 weeks after everything unraveled. I've known Weston since we were kids, she wrote. I always figured you two just split things evenly. I had no idea it was all you. I'm sorry I said what I said at that cookout. I didn't respond with much. A simple thank you. I appreciate that. But it mattered more than I expected it to, hearing someone outside the marriage finally say the quiet part out loud. Paula became something closer to an actual friend in the weeks that followed, which surprised both of us, I think. She called me on a Tuesday night, about 10 days after the confrontation, and told me a story I'd never heard before, about her own first marriage, 20 years earlier, to a man who used to introduce her at parties as my wife. She doesn't work, despite the fact that she'd been running the books for his construction business, unpaid, for 6 years. I recognized what you were describing the second Weston told me about it, she said. I just didn't say anything for a long time because it's Weston, and he's my brother, and you don't want to believe your own brother would do something like that on purpose. She paused. But he did it on purpose, Vivian. I read that email he sent Denise. There's no accident in a sentence like that. Weston's desperate moves started slow and then came in a rush, the way water does right before a dam actually fails. First, it was texts, long ones, paragraphs at 2 in the morning, alternating between apology and blame in a way that made them hard to finish reading. I never should have let it go on this long. You have to understand, Kellen's just a kid. Kids say stupid things. You're really going to throw away 8 years over this? I read most of them. I answered none of them. Then came the calls to my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Odalis Ferrer, who I'd hired the week after the sale closed, mostly to make sure the divorce filing would be airtight given how much money had moved between us without formal documentation over the years. Weston's own attorney, apparently on his instruction, floated the idea that the house sale constituted marital property that should have required his consent, an argument that lasted exactly as long as it took Odalis to produce the original deed, dated 3 years before our marriage, my name the only one on it, along with 8 years of mortgage-free property tax filings that had never once listed him as an owner of record. The claim disappeared from the conversation within a week. Odalis also walked me through something I hadn't fully considered until she raised it. The 8 years of property tax filings for the Vesper Lane house, every single one filed under my name alone, every homestead exemption application signed only by me, a paper trail 8 years deep that made the ownership question almost laughably simple to settle. Some of my clients spend 2 years untangling a marital home, she told me over the phone one afternoon, papers rustling on her end. You made this easy for yourself 8 years ago without even realizing you were doing it. Every time you didn't add his name to something, you were protecting yourself. I hope you can eventually see that as something other than an accident. I didn't have a good answer for her either, not that day. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to stop viewing my own caution as some kind of failure of trust in my marriage, and to start seeing it instead as the one instinct in 8 years that had actually served me well. There was a brief, strange complication with the homeowner's insurance policy too, a mess of paperwork involving the closing date and a partial refund on the annual premium I'd paid in full back in January, money that technically belonged half to a policy period that had already ended by the time Ruiz Capital closed on the property. It resolved itself within a few weeks, a check for $1,100 showing up in my new mailbox in Fort Wayne with a form letter attached, but I remember standing in that hallway holding the envelope and laughing, actually laughing out loud, alone, at the sheer administrative absurdity of it all, that a marriage could unravel over a text message and a driveway confrontation, and still Still, weeks later, be settled in tidy increments through insurance refunds and notarized deed transfers, as if love and heartbreak could be filed away in the same drawer as everything else. Then, the last and strangest move of all. Weston showed up at cross-ledger bookkeeping on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the cruise, before I'd even finished the process of transferring my client files to be managed remotely from Fort Wayne. Raina called me in a panic. "He's here, Viv. He's standing in the lobby. What do you want me to do?" I drove the 4.5 hours back to Millhaven myself, mostly because I didn't trust Raina to handle it alone, and partly because some part of me, I think, needed to see him one more time in a room that wasn't a phone call. He looked smaller than I remembered, standing there in the sunroom that used to be my office, hands shoved in his jacket pockets like a boy waiting outside a principal's door. "I made a mistake," he said. "A real one. I know that now. Can we just talk, please?" "We are talking," I said. "I mean, really talk, about fixing this." "There's nothing to fix, Weston," I said, and I meant it gently, which surprised me, because gentleness was not what I expected to feel standing in front of him again. "You didn't misplace something you can find and give back. You made a choice, over and over, for 8 years, and I finally stopped absorbing the cost of it. That's not a mistake in the way you're using the word. That's just who you decided to be. Every single time it would have cost you 30 seconds to say my name out loud." He didn't have an answer for that. I think, in a strange way, that was the most honest exchange we ever had. The divorce moved quickly once the paperwork was in motion, faster than either of us expected, mostly because there was so little left to actually divide. No jointly owned property, no shared mortgage. A modest joint checking account we'd used for groceries and utilities, split evenly down the middle without argument. It was finalized in early September, on a Tuesday, in a courthouse 2 counties over from Millhaven. Quiet and procedural. Nothing like the version of that day I might have imagined for myself 8 years earlier, standing at the altar in a church that smelled like lilies. I let myself grieve, somewhere in there, in a way I hadn't fully allowed until the paperwork was actually signed. Not for Weston, exactly, or not only for him, but for the specific, particular family I'd let myself imagine we could be. The one where Kellen eventually grew into a man who understood what had been given to him and by whom. The one where Weston learned, late but not too late, to say my name in rooms where it mattered. I sat on the floor of my new apartment one evening with the wedding album open across my lap, looking at a photograph from our 3rd anniversary, the 2 of us laughing on a dock somewhere in Michigan, Kellen 15 years old and rolling his eyes behind us in the corner of the frame. And I let myself cry for the first time since the whole thing started. Not for what happened, for what didn't, and now never would. Kellen texted me once, in October, 4 months after the cruise. It read, "I heard you sold the house. That's messed up, honestly. Hope you're happy." I read it twice, the way I'd read his first text months earlier, waiting for something in it to soften on a second pass. It didn't. There was no apology in it, no acknowledgement of the $11,400 or the $7,200 or the $6,800, no recognition at all of the years of quiet money that had built the very trip he'd banned me from taking. I didn't respond. Some doors, I've come to understand, are better left exactly where they are, neither slammed shut nor propped open, just closed. The way a door should be when there's nothing left on the other side worth reaching for. It's been a little over a year now since I sat at that kitchen table in the gray early light and added up 8 years of my own life on a piece of paper. I still live in Fort Wayne in a different apartment now, one with real hardwood floors and a small balcony where I keep a row of herb pots that have somehow, against all odds, survived 2 summers. Cross-ledger bookkeeping followed me here without missing a single client. It turns out most people don't care where their accountant lives as long as the numbers reconcile on time, and mine always do. I've added 4 new clients since the move, small businesses mostly, a bakery, a landscaping company, a woman who restores antique furniture out of a converted barn. I like the work more than I ever expected to. There's a particular satisfaction in a ledger that balances, in a column of numbers that finally tells the truth about who did what. I adopted a dog about 6 months after I moved, a scruffy, middle-aged terrier mix from the county shelter who'd been passed over twice for younger, flashier dogs. I named her Nickel, half as a joke about my profession, and half because it felt right. A small, plain, dependable thing that had simply been waiting for someone to notice her worth. She sleeps at the foot of my bed every night, and some mornings, when I wake up before my alarm the way I did on that last morning in Millhaven, I reach down and put my hand on her before I even open my eyes, just to remind myself that I'm not lying there waiting for a cruel text anymore. There isn't one coming. There's just a dog and a quiet apartment, and a life that is entirely, finally, mine. I talk to Paula every few weeks now. She drove out to visit me last spring, and we sat on that little balcony for hours, drinking wine and laughing about things that shouldn't have been funny yet somehow were. The specific dark comedy of surviving something together, even from opposite sides of it. She tells me Weston is still in Millhaven, still at Ferncrest Supply, renting a 2-bedroom apartment across town from the house that used to be ours. Kellen graduated and moved to Columbus with Bryn, working some entry-level job in sports marketing that Paula says he complains about constantly. I don't ask for more detail than that, and she's learned not to offer it unprompted. That part of my life isn't a wound I pick at anymore. It's just a chapter, closed, filed, reconciled. People ask me sometimes, when they hear the shorter version of this story, whether I regret how fast I moved, whether I wish I'd given Weston more time to prove he could change. I understand the question rejection. I even understand the impulse behind it. We're taught, especially women my age, that patience is a virtue and love is supposed to survive disappointment, that leaving quickly looks like cruelty, even when staying quietly was the actual cruelty all along. But I think about that email now. The one Denise never should have forwarded and I never should have found. 3 lines long, written 3 years before any of this came to a head. Vivian doesn't need credit for this stuff. He didn't write that in a moment of panic or exhaustion. He wrote it calmly, deliberately, as a strategy for managing his son's affection at my expense, and he never once, in 8 years, revised that strategy on his own. I didn't leave too fast. I left exactly as fast as the truth allowed once I finally let myself see it clearly. I think about the Jeep sometimes, still, more than I think about almost anything else from those years. $9,200, my money, and a 16-year-old boy hugging his father in a driveway while I stood 4 feet away, holding a ribbon I'd tied myself. I used to think that was the moment I should have walked away. Now I think it was simply the moment the entire shape of the marriage became visible. If I'd only had the courage to look at it directly instead of telling myself over and over for 8 consecutive years that it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was $28,400 in 2 years alone, and it was a lifetime before that of being the invisible engine running a family that had learned, collectively, without ever discussing it out loud, that my contributions simply didn't need to be spoken. I was never the poor woman in that family. I was the only one keeping an honest ledger, the only one who could have told you, to the dollar, exactly what love was costing me and exactly what it was returning. Everyone else got to live comfortably inside the story they'd told themselves. I was the one who eventually had to do the math. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from a decision like mine, and I want to be honest about what it does and doesn't feel like, because I think people expect a story like this to end in something closer to victory than it actually does. I don't feel victorious. I feel steady. I feel most days like a woman standing upright in a house that is entirely her own, which is a different thing than winning, quieter and more durable. There is still, underneath the steadiness, a small and specific sadness I don't think will ever fully leave me. Not for Weston, not really, but for the version of that family that could have existed if generosity had ever once been met with acknowledgement instead of silence. I wanted to belong somewhere. I wanted badly for 8 years to be counted as one of the people who mattered in that house, instead of the quiet mechanism that kept it running. That version of the story never got written, and I think it's allowed to hurt a little, even now, even from here, even with Nickel asleep at the foot of my bed and a balcony full of basil that somehow keeps surviving. Some mornings when I open my banking app now, just to check on things the way I always have, I think about that piece of paper I wrote the numbers on, $28,400, carried right to left the way my mother taught me. I think about how long it took me to let myself add it up, and how once I finally did, the answer was so obvious it almost embarrassed me. I wasn't poor. I had simply never once been asked what I was worth by anyone, including myself, and it took a cruel text at 5:58 in the morning to finally make me sit down and find out. I've started keeping a different kind of ledger since I moved here, one that has nothing to do with clients or invoices. Small things. A friend who insists on splitting the check down to the dollar without being asked. A new neighbor, an older woman named Carla, 2 doors down, who brought me a casserole the week I moved in and then actually asked how I was doing and waited for the real answer instead of the polite one. Raina, who drove all the way out from Millhaven last month just to help me repaint the guest room and refused to let me pay her for the gas. I write these things down now, not literally, not with a pen, but in the same part of my mind that used to only track what I was owed and never got. It turns out that ledger balances a lot more easily than the other one ever did, because the people in it were never keeping score to begin with. That, I think, might be the actual difference between a family and a household. One keeps an honest account without ever needing to be asked, and the other simply assumes the account will always be there, indefinitely, uncomplaining, unnoticed, until one morning it isn't. I still think about that starfish luggage tag sometimes, the one clipped to a suitcase that never made it onto a ship. I don't know what happened to it. I imagine it's still somewhere in a landfill outside Millhaven, buried under whatever else gets left behind when a life gets packed into boxes and driven 2 states away. I don't miss the cruise. I never once, in the year since, wished I'd been standing on that balcony watching the Bahamas slide by. What I miss, if I'm honest, is smaller and harder to name than that. The version of myself who still believed, right up until 5:58 that morning, that if she was just patient enough, generous enough, quiet enough, she would eventually be counted as family instead of funding. I don't believe that anymore. I think that might be the only inheritance this whole ordeal actually left me, truer and more durable than any house ever was. The plain, unglamorous knowledge that love which requires your erasure to survive was never really love at all. It was just accounting, dressed up in nicer language, and I was the only one in the room who ever bothered to check the math.